Hi everyone, today we're joined by Chin-Wei and Milad talking about their paper Riemannian Diffusion models.
Cool. Thank you, Hannes, for the introduction and for the invitation for us to give this talk. Our pleasure. So today I'm going to be giving this talk jointly. So me, myself, and Milad, who's also in the chat. I forgot to put a name here. So today I'm going to be talking about our not so recent work from NeurIPS last year about how to train a diffusion model for data types that are not necessarily Euclidean. More specifically, data that lies on a manifold. Diffusion models, they are kind of they're older age. They underline the success of recent applications of general models in large scale, image generation, for instance. And we can see here, we can generate very high quality, high dimensional object on the left here with a simple prompt on the right. And these kind of models, they are very expressive, very powerful, we're kind of interested in as a machine learner, like we're kind of interested in how we can kind of leverage the success to model different kind of data. So the goal of our project here is essentially try to figure out how we can do the same thing, but for different kind of data, and because there are other different data types out there which might be interesting to domain experts. So for instance, in our work, we mainly focus on stuff that can be, data that lie on a manifold, a smooth manifold. For instance, in natural sciences like biology or molecular science, we can kind of model the angles of things, like the torsion angle, the bond angle, for instance. In computer vision, computer graphics, people might be interested in the intensity on a manifold, kind of described by an implicit, like in an implicit way, for instance. There are other data type which kind of goes into the infinite dimensional space, where we're interested in things like functions, for instance. And this can be of particular interest to people who want to model functions for solutions for PDE, for instance. And of course, there are discrete data type where the most notable application will be text modeling in NLP, or you can also model all kinds of categorical value data for image segmentation, for instance. And there are also like constraint data type where you might be describing your data in the Euclidean space, but your value cannot exceed certain value, certain boundary condition, for instance. And our work will be primarily focused on the upper right corner, data that lies on the manifold. And in particular, we're interested in sort of generalized how we can build a diffusion model in the Euclidean space to also do the same thing for manifold, kind of using this notion that all of these data types that are highlighted here, they share this notion of continuity, and we want to sort of figure out how we can generalize the processes we have for Euclidean space to perturb the data little by little in this continuous kind of flavor. So to go into a little bit more detail, just a primer on diffusion probabilistic model, DDPM here. There are, for people who don't know about it much, so basically it's a generative model that gradually adds structure to a sort of noise prior. So we first sample from a noisy distribution, and then we will try to reconstruct some structure, and eventually we hope that the end result will resemble a structured data, like an image, like a cat, for instance. And in a variational kind of framework, like a variational autoencoder, it typically comes with the inference process. So that will infer the latent variable. And diffusion model is a particular type of VAE where the inference process here is a fixed encoder. So that's one view. And the other view of a diffusion model is we start with the data, and we're just gonna add noise until you cannot recognize the cat anymore. And we're gonna learn to revert this process. So there are these two views of a diffusion model. More concretely, we can parameterize the decoding process here using a Markovian transition kernel. So here you can see that at every single time step, we want to generate the next data point. We simply just parameterize the kernel using a neural network with some amount of noise. And the inference process, as I said before, is simply just a fixed kernel. So in this case, this particular parameterization essentially tells us that, okay, when we want to go from the data to the prior, we essentially just add a bit of a noise and we shrink the data a little bit so that eventually it's going to converge to a standard Gaussian distribution. And that's something that we can easily sample from. What happens here if we kind of reduce the step size and then we'll fix the total amount of time, right? So every time we have the step size, we double the number of time steps. Is that here it will naturally converge to a continuous time process. So for instance, if you look at this transition kernel, which is a Gaussian distribution, right? I parameterize it in a specific way where the mean is where I previously was, plus some perturbation, which is the neural network, for instance, a mu times the time step, and also a small amount of noise. If I reduce the time step to 0, then this will converge to a process which is defined anywhere between 0 and 1, which is terminal time here. And the benefit of this continuous time model versus a discrete time model is that we have a calculus now. So all kinds of a calculus that we know from undergrad or elementary calculus is everything holds here. So you can use chain rule, for instance, and tools like that will help us design a model on a manifold.
I want to describe what is the tricky part of defining SDE on the manifolds. So for example, let's say we have a sphere, which is a two-dimensional manifold. The first step is somehow representing the points. And for example, as we all know, we can just represent the points on a sphere with its x, y, and z coordinates. So what we're actually doing is we are embedding this two-dimensional manifold on an ambient space that is three-dimensional, which is the three-dimensional Euclidean space. So one can, I'm going to the next slide, but it's not moving. Okay, so the first thing is that we should, for example, here we're describing the SDE on the manifold as dx equals v0 dt plus v and a certain which integral with the Brownian motion. What's happening is this v0 and v are a smooth vector fields on the manifold. So on each point of the manifold, on each time, we are assigning a velocity to the point, which shows how this point is going to change. But there is a tricky part about this here. So, for example, if we compute the v and v0 on this specific point depicted on the manifold, you can see that if you parameterize v and v0 freely, the v may point outwards of the manifold. So if you are going to simulate this SDE, your point will just fall off the manifold, and after that it is invalid because the v0 and v are defined on the points on the manifold. There are two fixes for this. The first fix is that if you consider the tangential plane to the sphere, which is right now I'm showing it by this blue plane, you can just simply project back the extra direction back to the manifold. So for example, you can project the v vector back to this plane, So what you can do is, if you can parameterize freely, for example, this v0 prime, and it can take any direction in the ambient space. And if you have a projection back to the tangential plane operator, you can just parameterize your v0 in this way. So that's one way to constrain the SDE you have to always remain on the manifold. The other way is to take on an intrinsic view. So when we have a manifold, each part of it can be mapped to a Euclidean space by definition that the definition of a manifold tells us that each part can be mapped with a chart function, which I'm showing here by side. It can be mapped to a Euclidean space, which currently we are showing the coordinates of this Euclidean space by x tilde 1 and x tilde 2, and it is called the patch space. The thing is, and also you can go back from each point on this patch space back to the manifold with chart inverse function. And now if you describe your velocity vectors in this Euclidean space, which can take any direction, then it induces a velocity vector on the original manifold. And so here, for example, if you the velocity vector you have on the Euclidean space is this v tilde, it induces the velocity vector v, and the relation between these two is described by this Jacobian of the chart inverse function. And this Jacobian, its columns are tangential to the manifold, and because the Jacobian inverse being multiplied by this v tilde is a linear combination of these columns, the final result, which is the velocity vector v, will also be tangential to the manifold in your specific point x. So the other way to constrain your SDE is to describe the movement on this patch space and just get your original velocity vector via this Jacobian of chart inverse. Now that we know how to define an SDE that remains on the manifold, we can start on describing a generative SDE. So our generative SDE currently is dx equals v0 dt plus v, a certain which integral with the Brownian motion, where the x0 our starting points is coming from a prior distribution. So we have a prior distribution, and we also this process is describing how they are going to evolve. It's important to note that we are using a Sturtevant integral in v dbt, because the thing is, when in the literature, the integral that most people use is the Ito integral, but because in the manifold we want to move freely between the ambient space and the patch space, and this is done by the chart function, you need to use the chain rule. And the chain rule holds when you use a Sturtevant integral, so the mass is more clean, and the Sturtevant integral is more of a natural choice when you're working with manifolds. You can always change between the two, but I just wanted to point out this contrast with the literature on the Euclidean diffusion models. So if we want to visualize things a little bit, we can say when you have this diffusion process starting from the prior, if you look at the sphere on the left, you have a prior distribution over the sphere. For example, it's close to uniform, doesn't have any specific structure at time t0. And your process, which is this dx equals v0 dt plus vo dvt, is describing how this points and the probability mass is going to change, and how this point, any point on the manifold, is going to move. So if you integrate it out to time capital T, it induces another probability distribution on the sphere. So for example, here, the points are moving towards this major passes, like these two bold passes that we have on the sphere. And we are assuming the probability is being described, is this P function here. So that's our density function. And our goal is to design this V0, this velocity vectors, the V0 and V, in such a way that the probability that it induces at time capital T is closer to our close to our training data distribution or our data distribution, and the way that we do that is by doing maximum likelihood. So we want to maximize the likelihood that our model assigns to point x, where x is taken from the data distribution at time capital T, because our generative SDE starts from a time 0 and it ends at time t. We want the probability at time t to be close to our data distribution. So the first step is for sure to compute this quantity, the p of x and capital T. So what we have is a prior distribution. So we know what's the density of points on the prior. And also we know how these points are going to move. It's described by the diffusion process. So it occurs naturally that we should be able to somehow locally in time just describe whether a point on the manifold in a specific time is gaining density. So are the points like moving towards it, or is it losing density? So the probability is that the points are going to move outwards from it. For example, if the velocity vectors all move the points far from that point, so it's losing the density. And the Fokker-Planck is something that formally describes this time derivative of the probability density by a partial differential equation. So what is the time derivative of a probability density? It just tells us whether a point on the manifold at any specific time is it density, is it losing density or is it gaining density? Is the probability density increasing or decreasing? And the Fokker-Planck gives us a PDE that describes this time derivative of the probability density. And after you have this time derivative, you can use the Feynman-Kite theorem that solves this PDE, and it computes the exact probability of the point in that given time. So in order to go into a little bit more details, here you can see that the time derivative of our probability density is shown by this parabolic partial differential equation that has first order terms, which are shown in blue, and second order terms that are shown in golden color. And this parabolic PDE can be solved by the Feynman-Kite. So the Feynman-Kite is designed specifically for this kind of PDEs, and it gives us, it solves this PDE for giving us the exact probability density of point x at time t in the form of an expectation. And this expectation is with respect to another process that I show that is being described by the dy here. This is another process that operates in reverse time. So it starts from y0 equals x. So it starts from the data point that you care about. And then it evolves this point back in time. So this is the first major theorem that we prove. It is the marginal density when you have a degenerative ST. This is the marginal density. It shows the probability density of any given point at any given time, which is with respect to the process. But in order to give you a little bit of intuition of what's going on, these two giant terms here, the first one is just we are calculating what is the prior probability, what is the probability that the prior assigns to a point, and then this exponential of the integral of a divergence is just tracking whether this point is losing density or it is gaining density over time, and it keeps track of that. This expectation is taken with respect to lots of trajectories. So in lots of trajectories, you compute whether you're going to reach x at time t or not. But it is the intuition behind how it makes sense. So when we have so currently we have the marginal density px and t, which is this giant expectation. But the thing is, we want a training objective. So we want to maximize this probability density at time capital T. The problem with this as a training objective is that so at the end, you want to maximize the logarithm of this probability in order to do maximum likelihood. The problem is currently you have the logarithm of an expectation with respect to this process, and inside the expectation, you have an integral, which is intractable. Sorry, which is intractable. So you can use the Jensen inequality to push the logarithm inwards, as it's a very known trick. But there is a second problem, which is also very important. So this expectation is taken with respect to a specific SDE described here. But the most passes that are generated by this SDE actually assign little density to X. So I want to draw an analogy between the diffusion process we're describing here and VAEs. In VAE, your Z is being sampled from a normal distribution, and then you have a decoder P theta that assigns probability density to X given this Z. So if you want to know what is the probability that your generative model at the end produces point X, you can integrate or take an expectation over this Z that is following the normal distribution and multiplied by this P theta of X given Z. And you can also train a generative model with this objective given enough time. But if you want to make it more efficient, what people do and what gives birth to the VAE is that you use an encoder that propose another distribution on Z. So here we are using the encoder Q of psi, which is parameterized by psi, like the Q of psi. It proposes another distribution on Z given X. It focuses your samples on regions that are most probable to generate X, and then you use importance sampling to correct for the change of density. Similarly, we do the exact same thing in order to get a good training objective from our marginal density formulation. So the first thing that we do is that this expectation is with respect to a process, and we want to change this process. So we have a prior that was the process I described in the previous slides, and we want to have a proposal process, and we want to take this expectation with respect to this proposal process that we show by Q, and so it's that this expectation is taken with respect to the trajectories sampled from this proposal process, and we should also take into account the change of density between these two processes, and it is shown by the dp over dq here, which I hope you can see it's very close to what we did on the VAE side. But just here, the latent variables and the difference between the prior and proposal samples is that in the VAE it was a vector, currently it's a trajectory of points. And after doing this change of measure that increases our training efficiency and reduces the variance of our objective, we also use the Jensen inequality to push in the logarithm, and it gives us an evidence lower bound. So currently we have a formula that lower bounds are like probability that we assign to point X at time capital T, and it's in form of expectation, so we can estimate it via sampling, which is very desirable for a training objective. And as you can see, the term that appears in the expectation is because of this change of measure, because we changed our passes that we take our expectation with respect to. It's given to us by Girsonov theorem. So this is the proof sketch that gives us our elbow or evidence lower bound, which is really taken with respect to this inference SDE. And this inference SDE is parameterized by this A module, and it will be trained to focus the passes on passes that most probably assign the highest probabilities to X. So our training objective is has less variance when we want to estimate it by sampling. And this will be our training objective at the end, which is, as you can see, just evidence lower bound. We call it CT elbow. And the one thing to notice in the CT elbow is that there is a Riemannian divergence term inside the expectation on the previous slide. Can go back. Yeah, it's a Riemannian divergence term in the equation, and computing it is very important. And that's where I pass this to Chin-Wei.
Yeah, so Milad here just told us about how to derive a objective for training this division process. And there are many terms, right? Like we have this term that evaluates the sample at the prior, and we have this sort of like a regularization term that regularizes your like a proposal, like your encoder. And here we have our main laws here, which is the divergence of the vector field that tells us how to move, right? So that's the velocity of the moving particle in the generation direction. And so just to give a bit of an intuition of what this quantity is a divergence. So the divergence kind of informally is the negative accumulation of mass kind of in the like a small neighborhood around a point that we're interested in. So in a 1D case, basically it's a derivative of the velocity. So suppose here you have you're gaining velocity. So from the left, you have a smaller velocity. From the right, you have a larger velocity. Then intuitively, you're going to have more mass leaving the close neighborhood around it. Then that means you are going to be losing mass. And that means that since divergence is a negative accumulation, it basically tells you that the divergence should be positive here. And we can also generalize this quantity to a higher dimensional space, for instance, in 3D. So in this X direction, we are losing mass because we are gaining velocity. In the Y direction, we're losing velocity, so we're gaining mass. So there are more mass entering this small neighborhood than mass leaving this neighborhood from the other side. And in the Z direction, also, we have more mass entering than the mass leaving the system. In total, we just need to sum up all of the contribution in all these three directions. Then we have the divergence of this vector, basically, which is negative in this case. Then the natural question is, how do we reason about this notion of divergence in a manifold, right? Because that's what we care about here. So what's different from the Euclidean space here is that our vector field, they're always kind of they're always tangent to the point on the manifold. So you know, in order to compute it, we have to sort of take that into account. So if we perturb the vector field arbitrarily on this, you know, for instance, in this ambient space, it's problematic, right? Because the perturbation of this vector field might result in a direction that is not tangent anymore. So we don't care about the contribution that, you know, that's normal to the tangent, right? Because our points always lies on the manifold. So the intuitive fix here is to basically slap a projection matrix to project it back to the manifold. Basically, we just want to make sure when we're perturbing, like all of the contribution that is not tangential will be kind of projected away. So with this intuition, we also show that the Riemannian divergence can be computed in a very simple form in the ambient space. So we simply just take the Jacobian matrix of the velocity vector, But here we need to sandwich it with the projection matrix from the left and from the right. So make sure the perturbation, when we look at the differential of the x here, that the perturbation is its tangent, and also the resulting, kind of variation also is tangent as well. And we simply just take the trace of this matrix. We also propose a few numerical like routines to compute this quantity in practice. So for instance, we can, if we can find the orthogonal basis, then we can easily compute this quantity. So first of all, how do we get the orthogonal basis? We can, for instance, randomly sample two vectors, right? But we want our vectors to be tangent. So to do that, you can, for instance, just randomly sample a Gaussian vector and project it down to the tangent. And then we simply just perform a QR decomposition to orthogonalize the two vectors, the two tangent vectors. Then we would have an orthogonal basis. Then with an orthogonal basis, we can simply just rewrite the whole thing as a summation of, here we have a vector Jacobian product, and then a product with another vector, basically. So the vector Jacobian product here can be easily computed using reverse mode auto differentiation, and that can be computed quite efficiently. And you just need to compute that d times. So for in this case, this spherical manifold example, the ambient space has a dimensionality 3, and the real dimensionality of the manifold is 2. So we just need to do this procedure twice. And then for a higher dimensional problem, when D is large, we might not want to do this anymore. And we can also cheaply estimate this quantity by picking a random vector. So again, we can choose a vector in the ambient space. We just need to project it down to the tangent space. Then we just do this, reverse mode auto differentiation once, and then basically take we can use this quantity to estimate the trace. Then we would have an estimate of the divergence. And with this, we can estimate the lower bound on the log likelihood quite cheaply, and then use that to train our model. Now that we know how to train a model, Milad will tell us more about how we can use this model to model distributions on different kinds of manifolds.
Yeah. So the first experiments that we do are in a data set that describe the natural events that are happening on Earth. And we assume the Earth is modeled by a sphere. So these events are taking place on the sphere. Each point is on this sphere, and we are modeling the density of these points. So we have a training set that describes this events that has happened on Earth, which are earthquake, fire, flood, and volcanic eruptions. And we train our model on the training subset. And what we are showing you here, the blue color is depicting the density of the trained model on the training subset. And the red dots are the points from the test set that the model has not seen. And as you can see, the model successfully learned the density, the distribution of the data. Now I want to talk about the one trick that we used to train these models. So our training objective is this expectation that we have talked about a lot today. And as you can see, inside this expectation, there is an integral from time 0 to time capital T. And what people do in the literature when they want to compute this integral, is that they estimate it by changing it, by viewing it as an expectation over a random variable time s that is sampled from a uniform distribution between 0 and time capital T. So what they do is they sample from this uniform distribution a time, and then they calculate they calculate the point at that time, and then they calculate the loss for that point. The important thing is, empirically, we observe that the loss that the loss that we're optimizing is much higher for points that are closer to time 0. So it's just natural that you should focus the training samples more on this time, and then use the importance sampling trick to care for the change of densities. So we want to train another distribution, a proposal distribution, on the time variable. So we don't sample from this uniform distribution, we sample from another distribution, and we do the correction with for the change of this density, for the change of this distribution over time. And in our sphere experiment, we do exactly that. We model the time by single-dimensional normalizing flow. And as you can see, it is the learned density. As you can see, it focuses much more on times that are closer to 0. So it focuses the training time on the training on samples taken with the data distribution with just a little bit added noise, compared to samples that are noised a lot with our inference SDE. And you can see the difference. So in the blue plot, it indicates where we are just using the training objective, where you sample the time from a uniform distribution. This is showed by the blue color. As you can see, the loss is decreasing, but it kind of saturates in somewhere. I mean, it's decreasing very slowly. But if with the learned time sampling, with the learned QS, which is depicted by the orange color, you can see the loss is going down much faster, because I mean the training is just focused on places where the loss is high. This is so it was the importance sampling on time trick. The other experiments that we do is modeling the marginal torsion angles on amino acids, which are shown by phi and psi. For example, here we have the pre-proline amino acid, but in the paper we have like also other 3 types of this amino acids. But the thing is, same to the sphere plots, we are showing with the colors ranging from blue to green the density of the train model that we have, and the red dots are the test set points of like real data. As you can see, the model successfully learned to assign high likelihood to these data points. And actually, this experiment shows one advantage of when you model the data using the manifold. So here, naturally, the model has continuity when you switch from an angle that is 180 degrees to minus 180 degrees. While if you do it otherwise, for example, if you do it by modeling the density on the patch space, you don't have that natural continuity there. I mean, specifically, we can point out that the model learns the same density for angle 180 and minus 180. But otherwise, you should have forced it.
Here you're overfitting on the single molecule, right? And you're showing the which phi psi angle?
Oh, are we overfitting? What do you mean overfitting here?
Are you training on all of GM drugs, or are you training on a whole data set?
So for this, we just collected a few protein, and then we just chop it down into just the amino acids. So we don't model the entire chain. We only model the 2 torsion angles, like kind of just marginally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So is it a single molecule for which you are doing this, or are you training one molecule that should do this for one model that should do this for multiple molecules?
So it's multiple molecules, like crystal structures.
Okay.
Yeah.
How many?
How, like the size of the data set, or?
Yeah.
I think there are in total like 500 proteins. But then in total, if only look at the amino acids, I think we have on the order of a few thousand like tens of thousands, I think.
What do you mean if we only look at amino acids? Why do you have more proteins if you look at amino acids?
So that's what I mean. Like so for a protein, it's very long, right? We only look at these two psi and phi angles for each amino acids, and we just collapse them. Like we don't train a model for the entire chain.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's a Tori kind of experiment to show that you can parameterize a diffusion model of Tori. Yeah.
Okay. So this has nothing really to do with like torsional diffusion, for example.
No. So torsional diffusion is essentially you don't do this. You don't collapse them. You also model them jointly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I wanted to say why this is a tori. So because the psi and phi are angles, they reside in a circle, and when you model them jointly, the points are in the product of two circles, which is a tori. So yeah, as pointed out now, we are modeling the marginal torsion angles, but the torsional diffusion model paper models the entire chain of the protein. One thing that is so why can't I go to one thing is generally when we are training these models on the manifolds, in order to get a noisy sample, for example, so you sample time and you want to integrate from your data point to the YT to a noisy version of this data point at time t. In order to obtain YT, we need to integrate. In Euclidean diffusion models, the diffusion process is designed in such a way that you can directly sample the noisy data point at any time. For example, in the DDPM paper, you can directly sample it. But we need to integrate on the manifold. We don't have that luxury. But in Tori, the one good aspect is that when you add when you noise with the Brownian motion on the Tori, the formula is very simple. It becomes a wrap normal. So we can use direct sampling to sample the YT. And what we do is we're doing an ablation study to see what's the effect of the need to integrate on the training time. One good thing is that in this integration, our neural nets, which is like the A module, is not involved. So what we observed empirically is that this integration is very fast, and it has not increased our training wall time significantly. Actually, we haven't observed like most of the training time is on the backward computation, and on the neural net, the integration is just a tiny amount of time. But in order to assess whether it is harming the training, in the left plot, we are training our models with different integrations. So the purple line is when you use direct sampling to sample the YT, and the green line is when you just use one integration step, and the red line shows when you use 3 steps, and so on. And as you can see, if we use 100 steps, it gets just basically the same as the direct sampling. And in the right plot, we are evaluating the models that are trained on the left with different numbers of samplings. And as you can see, the thing that you observe is if you train with a very few integration steps, for example, in the green plot, you tend to underestimate your loss. So at the right plot, you can see that the loss is actually very high. But as we increase the number of integration steps, they become basically the same thing. And we also do experiments on rotational matrices on the SO3 group, and we can learn densities on them. And these rotation matrices are everywhere on natural sciences because rotation is everywhere. And for example, in the DIFDAC paper, the authors are interested in modeling the rotation of ligands, and they use diffusion models on the rotation matrices, diffusion models to model this rotational matrices. Yes, I'll pass it to Chin-Wei, like what other works in this area.
Thank you. So I just want to point out that like in our work, it's more of a like a general recipe for designing diffusion model on arbitrary manifolds, and there are also like different works out there that are kind of customized for the arbitrary manifolds. For instance, for orthogonal groups, like there's probably better way for sampling and better way to construct the laws. Also the same thing for Tori as well. Yeah, so and also for diffusion model, like in our work, we also follow the like my previous work of deriving the elbow. There's a different kind of way around. You can also view this as a score-based model by learning to match the score via a parameterized function. And so in our work, we have this A function, which is kind of analogous to this score function. So there's also another line of work which kind of derive the same thing, but from the score matching perspective. And of course, there are also other kind of data types, for instance, discrete data type, ordinal data, for instance. And for discrete data type, you can no longer parameterize using a stochastic differential equation with the Brownian motion because it's not a continuous state space. But you can use other tools from the Markov chain theory to model these processes, for instance. And there's actually a very general treatment that can basically cover all of the bases here for manifold data, for categorical data as well. And also just to point out that there's also particularly interest in modeling data with constraints in different natural science domains as well. I think Aaron Liu would also give a talk in 2 weeks. Who will tell us more about how we can design diffusion models with a specific tool for reflection, for instance, so that we can design a model that wouldn't leave some constraint boundary, for instance. And there are different kinds of ways to do it as well. You don't necessarily need to use the traditional diffusion model kind of recipe. You can also use something called the diffusion bridge, which will constrain your diffusion process to go into a pre-specified domain, for instance. And there are also some exciting recent work on generalizing diffusion model to infinite dimensional space. And there, the kind of technical difficulty there is that if you consider diffusing a function, you don't want to perturb your data now with a white noise process, right? Because if you add noise to a smooth function, then you're gonna lose all of your high frequency features right away. So in some of these works, they also propose to perturb functions with something called the random Gaussian field, for instance. And then you're gonna see your data can be perturbed in a more continuous manner. Yeah. So with that, yeah, I will conclude our talk today. Yeah. Any questions are welcome.
Okay, thanks for the summary, and also thanks for the related work and mentioning that Aaron's talk is coming up, so I don't have to make that advertisement anymore. Yeah, in 2 weeks we have something very related, I think. 2 weeks. Yeah, I don't know the exact number of weeks, but thank you for the nice presentation and the talk. And yeah, I would have some questions regarding applications. Like, all of these diffusion models that are coming out now, and maybe I'm a person who doesn't now want to read the diffusion model paper for this space and that space, and then for these constraints, and then the infinite spaces, and get into all the different diffusion papers. And then I don't really, yeah, is there maybe a one application where these general sorts of frameworks already had some real world, or tackled some real world tasks better than before? Like maybe here this fluid dynamics examples, or here you're drawing something with spherical harmonics. Yeah, what is that about?
Right. So as far as I know, there hasn't been a lot of success yet. I think the paper by Milad, like they actually model use a diffusion model to generate the solution of Navier-Stokes equation, I think. And I've also heard about some people working in roughly the same direction. So that's something kind of interesting to look at. But I would say like most of the relevant work applying diffusion model, like with the non-Euclidean space, I think most of them are maybe in computational biology, like yours own work as well, right? Like where you model the torsion angle, the rotational group, for instance. That's probably the more natural application. But yeah, I mean there are many things that you can think of, I guess, like in electronic structure theory, where people also parameterize things like wave functions using orthogonal matrices, for instance. That's also kind of interesting. Yeah.
Okay. And then what's your what are your interests in terms of applications?
So right now I'm not applying diffusion model to manifold data myself, but yeah, just not my current ongoing work. Yeah.
Okay. Is there anything you're excited about and want to share already? Give some teasers for the public, what they should be looking out for.
I would yeah, I don't know. I mean like what we've been working on, or
No, maybe just very generally. You should probably not share your concrete project or as you wish, but I like to say, for example, that people should be more excited about generative models for molecular simulation.
yeah. So I think that's something that's kind of something that can potentially be like highly impactful, right? Like using these kind of models to generate as we kind of discussed earlier before the talk, like you know, to estimate things like free energy difference, for instance. And there are more and more efforts, as far as I know, trying to learn a model that's more transferable, for instance, which is very challenging. And having the model like the diffusion model or normalizing flow even allows you to kind of compute the density of these samples, and then which is like a principle for you to do it. And then you can use that to sort of calibrate your model's fidelity by doing like importance weight reweighting, for instance. But for higher dimensional problems like protein, like maybe that's just too challenging, right? Like to model all the degrees of freedom of a protein. Then maybe also just highlight another work of ours. Maybe we want to model a coarse-grained degree of freedom, for instance, right? So we might reduce the dimensionality of the problem, and there we might be able to we might have a better hope that this kind of model can generalize.
Okay, good. I like to hear that those are directions I'm interested in for sure. And we have a question in the chat. Can you suggest a short reading/textbook chapter or something to get an understanding of all this math on manifolds?
So I think, so in our paper, we have a few references. Yeah, so let me just read the text myself. Yeah, so I think the book by Lee, I think, is pretty good. I kind of closely follow the derivation of that book, which is pretty clean. Yeah.
All right, awesome. Then I would say, if there are no more questions here, then we can relegate any future questions that come up to emails and say a last thank you to you too.
Thank you, Hannes, for the invitation again.
Yeah, thank you.
Right.
Thank you for having us.
Goodbye.
Good. Then see you everyone, and hopefully see you guys next week. Bye.